So, well, let's get more reaction on the budget speech and the country's economy. We're joined now by political economist Moeletsi Mbeki, who joins us from Johannesburg. Mr. Mbeki, thank you very much for your time. I know you were listening to that interview we've just done with Fitch. Your immediate reaction to what the sentiment is about the country's finances?
Well, I think the Fitch made the point very clear that they are very concerned with our rapid rise of debt to gross domestic product over the past 10 years. I think he gave that time horizon. And then secondly, he pointed out that there is a link between this rise in debt and the low economic growth of South Africa, which seems to me to be his biggest concern, actually, is not so much the debt to GDP ratio, but the fact that the South African economy is really not growing.
Yeah.
And that seems to be his biggest concern.
So having listened to him then, do you think a further downgrade to junk status is avoidable?
I don't think so. I think he pointed out what he want that the rating agencies would like to see. They would really like to see the government and South Africa as a whole, not just the government, but the country, put more effort into achieving higher economic growth instead of where we are, where our economic growth is less than our population growth, which means that the country and the people are getting poorer.
Yeah.
So that's what I gathered was really the key concern. Now, if we can, as a country, and I think it's doable, but if we can do it, then I think the rating agencies will not look at South Africa in such a negative way.
Before we get into specifics about the budget speech, your overall sentiment of the finance minister's speech yesterday?
Well, for me, the most important thing about the finance minister's speech is not so much the figures that he gave us. It's the political context that is emerging in the ANC and its allies. That, to me, is the fundamental issue. And that, interestingly, is the issue that the rating agency, that gentleman talked about as well.
Yeah.
What is emerging from this budget, to me, the most important thing about this budget is that it is showing that the influence of South Africa, of the ANC's allies, who were its allies in the fight against apartheid, is waning. If they haven't been thrown overboard already by the ANC. What came out to me, or what was most striking about the budget, is first that the trade unions and civil society, which have been close allies of the ANC is now ignoring what they are saying, especially Cosatu, the Congress of South African Trade Unions. The public sector wage really refers to Cosatu unions. So the freeze of the unilateral freeze of the public sector unions is telling the unions that we no longer depend on you to be elected. Whether you vote for us or you don't vote for us, this is how we're going to manage things. That's message number one. To me, that's a very, very important message, which incidentally, the gentleman from Fitch is trying to understand, but nobody is explaining it to him. The second message is that the ANC no longer depends on the black urban working class, especially the organized labor, for its vote. It depends on the rural poor and on the urban poor for the vote.
Yeah.
So what you see in the budget is a very poor-friendly budget. The budget, both the medium-term budget from last year and the budget today is very friendly towards the poor. So that is reinforcing the message that the ANC government no longer depends on organized labor and working people. It depends on the poor and on the unemployed to get elected. We are having a...
Correct me if I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Mbeki. Am I hearing you correctly here when you say, yes, the ANC no longer depends on its left allies for them to be elected? They are able to do it themselves. But more importantly, to your point where you say the budget is pro-poor, the argument yesterday by Cosatu, in fact, was that this is actually a budget that doesn't take into account poor people in the country, because for the first time in a decade, social grants have been raised by not to the level that is in line with inflation.
Yes, I think we have to be careful not to get caught out in the domestic fight between the ANC and Cosatu. The reality is that, as the Minister of Finance pointed out, within the means that the government has, they have increased the social grants, the social welfare, and they have brought in even people on the 350 Rand program. They brought in people who were not in the social grant. So that to me is a clear illustration of the government's spending on the poor. Cosatu and the other NGOs want what they call the basic income grant. And I think they thought that the government was going to introduce something similar to the basic income grant. But obviously the implications on the debt to GDP ratio of the basic income grant was probably what constrained them from doing it.
Yeah.
So that is, so I wouldn't say the budget was not pro-poor. I think the budget is very pro-poor, and the ANC politics are increasingly pro-poor. It's just that the organized labor, especially Cosatu, they see themselves being divorced or in this relationship. So they feel, as they say, jilted by their old partner, and they are now trying to, in a way, disinform the public.
That's an interesting point you're making, because we've already seen the ructions between Cosatu and the ANC, and I think that was made much clearer when NUMSA, the biggest union in Cosatu, left, and that basically defined the relationship, at least on that year, what was to become of the relationship between Cosatu and the ANC. Interestingly, as we speak, the CEC of Cosatu is expected to address the media, and my sense is that they are in fact addressing the media as we speak. What do you then foresee this relationship becoming? Because if what you're saying is correct, then there is no longer a relationship that should exist here.
Well, as I say, if you about domestic violence, the woman who is being violated, for many reasons, continue to stay in a relationship. So that's one scenario that I expect from Cosatu, is that they will probably continue to stay in the relationship. Because Cosatu now, most of the Cosatu unions are actually the ones that are being most heavily hammered by the wage bill, the public wage bill actions of that the government is taking. It's the teachers, it's the nurses, it's the health workers, and so on. So those are the people who are really suffering, whose agreements, for example, which they had with the government unilaterally canceled the agreement, and the unions went to court, and the courts supported the government. The unions are now going to the Constitutional Court. Well, anything can happen in the Constitutional Court, but I doubt if the Constitutional Court will reverse, because the money is not there anyway.
Yeah.
So Cosatu could either walk away like NUMSA did, or it can stay there in this very unhappy marriage.
Well, it's an interesting turn of events then, because Cosatu, as we know it, it came out first to say Cyril Ramaphosa is our candidate for ANC president. And so for them to be treated this way at a time or in a year that the party, the governing party, the ANC, is going to go to its midterm review conference, and that's the NGC. What does that say about Mr. Ramaphosa's chances of coming back for a second term in office? Or is that something that he's already given up on?
Well, I don't think Ramaphosa needs Cosatu to come back to be re-elected in the ANC conference, in the next ANC conference, because that's where the crux of the decision gets made. I don't think he needs Cosatu. Anyway, Cosatu has been making calls on ANC leaders, which he then regrets. Remember, Cosatu supported Jacob Zuma at Polokwane, and since then, both the then Cosatu Secretary General,
he apologized.
He has been apologizing, and so has his younger brother, Julius Malema, who was also behind the election of Jacob Zuma in Polokwane. So it looks like the Cosatu doesn't fully understand the internal politics of the ANC, although they are allies.
And the SACP, just out of interest, where do you see them in this? Or are they non-existent anyway?
Well, the SACP are a marginal player. They are not a big constituency like the trade unions. The trade unions have hundreds of thousands of members, so they influence the vote. So that's where their importance lies. The Communist Party is more like a palace faction, if you wish. So they influence the politics within the court, within the palace, but they have no real impact. They did try to stand on their own, I think, in one of the by-elections, and they couldn't win anything. They couldn't win the primary vote in that by-election. So they don't really have the numbers when it comes to the vote. So for the ANC, the ANC keeps the Communist Party. It's like a beauty queen from the ancient past, because it has a history of illustrious names like Joe Slovo, Rufus, Chris Hani, Moses Kotane, and so on. So they're a good kind of relic from the past to carry around with you when you need them. You can show that you were once a revolutionary, you, the ANC. Now time.
Mr. Mbeki, you are not going to be liked by that party, the African National Congress and its allies. Let's wrap up our conversation and talk about Eskom. Do you sense there's a real plan to turn things around there? It remains the biggest risk to whether or not this economy does indeed turn around. And Fitch also does mention it, interestingly.
Yes, well, Eskom is part of the structural changes that the rating agencies and other institutions that work with South Africa, like the World Bank, the IMF, and so on, have been calling for. And us South African citizens, we also want Eskom to work properly. We don't want to be in the dark every other day the way that Eskom is performing. Personally, I don't see how Eskom is going to change. They have a new CEO, they have a new board chairman, but Eskom is an organization of thousands of people. Changing the chairman of the board and changing the CEO doesn't change the culture of the organization. The first thing is that Eskom is hugely overstaffed, and it has been said over and over and over again, but the new CEO and the new board chairman haven't changed the overstaffing of the organization. If anything, they are increasing the cost of electricity, which is then adding another problem to the problem of challenges of economic growth that Eskom is contributing to the economy of South Africa, the negative contribution so I'm not expecting any changes. The introduction of independent power producers by the government the government is very clearly doesn't want to do it. It's been very piecemeal. And if you look at the bids that the government set up, they have so many demands on the private contractors that I doubt that they will be profitable anyway. So in a way, the government and Eskom have trapped each other, and sadly, they've trapped the country as well.
Mr. Mbeki, thank you very much for your time. Moeletsi Mbeki, a political economist, weighing in on the response by ratings agency Fitch and indeed weighing in on the budget speech by the finance minister.